Every day is going to be very taxing if everything has a moral implication. Imagine having to wake up and asking yourself whether to wear your slippers or to not wear your slippers will affect society. Crazy, right? In our last discussion, we talked about morality, the definition of morality, the different ethical inquiries, and the necessity of moral standards. Today, we will talk about the difference between moral and non-moral acts and why there is a need for us to understand these two ideas. First, let's go back to the definition of morality. Morality refers to the standards that a person or a group has about what is right and wrong or good and evil. Therefore, when we speak of morality, it is a collective understanding of good and bad by a person or a specific group. Moral standards, on the other hand, are concerned on the distinction between good or bad or the right or wrong. This speaks of the rules that people agree and follow to be right or wrong. Oftentimes, we equate this with moral values and moral principles. It is important to differentiate moral standards from non-moral standards or acts. These are rules that are unrelated to moral or ethical considerations. These standards are not necessarily linked to morality or by nature lack ethical sense. For example, you don't necessarily make a moral judgment when you wear clothes, or when you eat your lunch, or when you read a book. Although, because of the growth of our consciousness to different societal issues, we realize that sometimes there are ethical relevance to these issues depending on the context of a situation. Like, for example, while you don't really make a moral judgment when you buy clothes, it's a different story when it's created by slaves from Africa. Knowing the difference between moral and non-moral acts will help us understand whether there is a need for a moral judgment in a given situation. Now let's try to look into these examples and identify which of the following are considered as non-moral acts. Number 1, I should eat lunch. Number 2, I should steal from my parents. Number 3, I should watch TV. And number 4, I should kill my pet dog. We'd all agree that we really don't need to make a moral judgment when we eat our lunch or when we watch TV. However, there is a moral judgment when we talk about stealing or killing. Based on the examples above, we can say that unlike non-moral standards, moral standards are based on value. Therefore, instead of being descriptive, there is a moral judgment that is required as these acts tend to affect society. There is a judgment of the world, which implies that there is a need to determine whether the act is right or wrong, or whether the norm should be accepted or rejected. In order to differentiate non-moral acts from moral acts, here are some characteristics that further separates the two. Number 1, moral standards involve serious wrongs or significant benefits. They deal with matters which can seriously impact, injure, or benefit human beings or the society as a whole. Second, moral standards ought to be preferred to other values. In terms of the hierarchy of standards, moral standards tend to be of higher preference because it is a standard that applies and should be applicable to all. They are not only standards which are created by a specific society or by a specific group of people, but it is a standard that is created from reason. Moral standards are not established by authority figures. The most concrete example here is the law. While we agree that the law are rules that are created by the society in order to promote the good and the welfare of all, we also have to remember that there are some things which we may consider as legal but not necessarily moral. Moral standards have the trait of universalizability or universality. This means that everyone should live up to moral standards. Moral standards are not only applicable to all, but it is a standard that should be upheld by all. Number 5. Moral standards are based on impartial consideration. Therefore, moral standards does not evaluate based on the specific interest of a certain person or a certain group. Rather, moral standards look at standards of everyone and sees everything as equal. And when we say impartiality or impartial considerations, that means it's objective, free from biases and prejudices, and it goes beyond the different social classes and inequalities that are happening in society. Another thing that you have to remember are what we call amoral acts. Amoral acts are actions performed by someone who is not morally aware or doesn't have a concept of morally right or wrong. These acts involve areas exhibiting indifference to and not abiding by the moral rules or codes of society. You have to remember that an immoral action by one person could be considered non-moral by a specific society depending upon the moral code of the society. Today we talked about moral, non-moral, and immoral actions, and we realized that not all actions require moral judgment or moral decisions. However, when our actions already tend to intervene with the freedom of others, or when the equal opportunity to exercise one's right is already affected, then maybe we should pause, think, and reflect before doing something.